I'm curious to hear what you think, sort of what has made these technologies so successful? Is it that there was a need or that they created the need? And sort of how does your point of view after chatting with all of these amazing individuals that started these crazy things?
Well, I think one of the great things, right, about all great technology in hindsight uncovers a need that people didn't realize they had. The iPhone, for example, is a sort of classic example of that. You know, no one invented the iPhone until the iPhone came along, and we'd had 10, 12 years of PDAs and cell phones. And in hindsight, the need was so obvious. It was obvious to the tune of $1 trillion of market share. But as Steve Jobs, you know, famously said, your customers don't know what they want until you show it to them. So there's this tension in innovation and technology between iterative innovation, which is what the banks do and a lot of big tech companies do, is just like constantly improving. And then this sort of Edisonian, Fordian view of innovation, which is like, you know, Ford said, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, I'd have given them a faster horse. You know, where it's your customers are actually idiots. No one knows. You're the genius, the great man of history or great woman of history. And you go into a room and you invent the future and you come out and you show it to people. It's so obvious in hindsight. So there's this tension. You can't really have good innovation without both types. And I think, so there is an element whereby there was a need, but people didn't realize there was a need. A lot of it goes back, a lot of, I'll say a couple of things. One is about the transaction experience. I think if anyone is listening on this call, what you will notice is that your transaction experience is disappearing. So in fact, actually, the best thing that's happened to money is the best thing that's happened to payments and money is that you don't experience it as much. You don't take as much cash out of the ATM, and places like Uber or Amazon, there's no actual transaction experience. They've removed that entirely. So the better the technology becomes, the more ubiquitous the technology becomes, the more hidden the experience of payments become. People don't like paying for things. They like buying things, but they don't like paying for them. And so I think one of the story is this, the part of the story is just about removing the transaction experience from your life. And if you extrapolate that into the future, we will never have a transaction experience. Everything will be just the scan of an eyeball or a thumbprint, or just say out loud, I want, you know, Alexa, I want, and you'll just get it. And there will be no payment experience in the world. I think a lot of it goes back to what I said right at the outset about financial literacy. We in finance are the only industry that beats up on our customers that they don't know how to use our stuff. And I've always found that to be really weird, because there's no other industry that chastises its customers as much as finance does to better use its very difficult to use tools, right? You don't need to know how electricity works to turn on the light switch. You don't have to program a computer to use it. You know, before she passed away, my 94-year-old grandmother was using FaceTime, you know, and that's the genius of the iPhone. My 3-year-old daughter can pick it up, and it's just immediately intuitive. But for some reason in finance, we sort of have this attitude that you have to sort of sit down and I have to teach you all about bond yield and compound interest in order for you to be able to use it. And I think one of the things that unifies all of the technologists in this book is that they sort of had this idea that why can't it be just easy? Why can't it just be beautiful and easy to use? So user experience, user design. John Stein, who's a chapter in this book, he's the CEO and founder of Betterment, which is a robo-advisor, probably, you know, one of the godfathers of robo investing. You know, he once said to me, and this was before we wrote the book, you know, he said, financial literacy is BS. It's all just a matter of user design. And he's right. I think about a product. I recently downloaded something called Stash. I don't know if anyone has, oh, sorry, not Stash, Digit. I don't know, they're similar. Don't know if anyone has something called Digit or Stash. They round up, they sort of, they're automatic savings apps. They just sort of look at your, you know, your bank account. They look at your spending patterns, and if they can pick up a penny here and a penny there, and stash it away for you, they will. And it's genius. I save a ton of money that I wouldn't have otherwise saved. And I think that's a great example of something that is just seamless, that is just saying, you know what, you can't be trusted. don't worry about trying to say
Take it away.
We'll do it for you. Just take. And I think a lot of people were asking for that from their financial services providers. But of course, the financial services companies, you know, with the greatest respect, again, don't get paid for the amount of money you save. They get paid on the amount of credit you take.
You said that you interviewed 154 individuals.
Yeah.
How did you choose to include, you know, who to include in this book? What was sort of the criteria, and was there someone or something that you had to leave out because it just didn't fit?
Oh my gosh, I had to leave like 3 books out. That's what they never tell you when you write a book, is how much you have to leave out. I'm reminded Mark Twain said, you know, I'm sorry for the length of the book. I couldn't, you know, I didn't have the time to make it shorter. So, you know, that's what the editing process is. They sort of cut. So like whole industries we didn't really talk about. So we didn't touch on what I would call sort of commercial fintech, so things like Stripe and Square. So the fact that now everyone with a cell phone is turned into a merchant and can, you know, you go to your local grocery market or your, you know, your vegetable market or whatever, and they're all standing there with their cell phones with their little Square dongle in, and, you know, it's all cashless. We didn't touch on that at all. Real estate is the world's largest financial asset, and we didn't touch on real estate and all the incredible technology that's happening in real estate. We talked a little bit about China, but we didn't. We could have written whole chapters about China. I mean, if you really want to see what the future of money and technology looks like, look at China, with these incredible, you know, multifunctional apps like WeChat. And then in terms of individuals, people, I'm sad we didn't get to include people who were just really good, thoughtful guides. People like Jennifer Tescher from the Financial Health Network. The problem was, this is a book focused on individuals, so we had to profile a lot of people. So we already went into it with sort of 100 profiles. So if you weren't profiled in the book, if you were just someone who just gave a lot of good advice, you unfortunately didn't make it into the book, because otherwise there was just no room for my words, if that makes sense. It was sort of my voice, and then the experts themselves, or the individuals, the money hackers themselves, and their stories. But there were a lot of great people who gave great advice along the way, and unfortunately I just couldn't put them in the book.
So kind of shifting to current state of affairs, you know, in the Money Hackers, you suggest that it was the massive disruption, suggest that a massive disruption, the global financial crisis, was the catalyst to a lot of these innovations in fintech. Can you talk a little bit about why, and then what does that tell us about our current crisis and where you think the future of finance is going?
Great question. So yes, the book begins in 2008 because it really is a story of 2 perspectives. In 2008, for me, being in finance, I think Bear Stearns, I think Lehman Brothers. I remember standing outside Lehman Brothers, you know, as the lights went off and watching people exit with their boxes. You know, that was the story of 2008 for me. But there's a whole, you know, there's a whole coast of people, the West Coast, and a whole industry of people for whom 2008, that wasn't the story. 2008 represented a number of other really important milestones. The launch of the App Store on the iPhone, which had only launched the year before. The launch of Facebook hitting 100 million users. Platforms like Facebook and Google and Amazon really achieving ubiquity, and the dream of the 90s and the dot-com bubble, you know, of ubiquity first, revenue later, that was really starting to come to fruition in 2008. So you have 2, you know, very different stories happening at the same time. The lesson the banks learned from 2008 was precisely the wrong lesson to learn at that moment. They looked around and they said, we've been innovating. You told us to innovate. We've been innovating. We've built all of these clever asset classes, like constructs, like derivatives, credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations. Look at how innovative we were. That nearly blew up the world. Innovation is bad. And also, and to be fair to the banks, under pressure from successive administrations, starting in the Clinton era, we were told to lend further down the market. We were told to offer mortgages and credit to basically less and less deserving people, in an effort to combat redlining and all these other things. And so we did that. We lent lots of money, and then we used our innovation to create constructions to defray that risk. And now you guys are all shouting at us. So the conclusions that the banks drew at that time were the mass market is danger and innovation is danger. So let's stop offering services to the mass market, and let's stop innovating. And of course, the conclusion that the technologists drew in 2008, looking at the promise of things like Facebook, looking at the birth of things like the App Store, were one, we have these incredible ecosystems on which to innovate. There's never been a better time to innovate. And look at the success of Google, look at the success of Amazon. There's real money to be made in the mass market. So you have two groups of people looking at the same situation and deriving two utterly different conclusions. There's a funny story, maybe apocryphal, of two shoe salesmen from Manchester at the turn of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, 1800s. And they were sent to Africa to see if they could open up a market for shoes. And one telegrammed back, situation hopeless, no one here wears shoes. And the other one's telegrammed back, amazing opportunity, they haven't got any shoes yet. And that is the story of 2008, and that is the vacuum that was left by the banks, into which these nascent technology companies came along and started lending us money and helping us split payments, and helping us figure out our credit and all the things that banks used to do that they totally shied away from doing in 2008. These technologists were more than happy to take up the reins. So that's the story of the last crisis. If crises dramatically change behavior, so look at something, we're using Zoom now. I think Zoom started this year with 10 million users. It now has 250 million users. So in a crisis, our behaviors change. I think also crises expose our logical fallacies, and they change that, the things that we thought we knew for sure, that changes, right? So I think in December of 2019, we might have said, I think it would have been fair for me to say something like, of course, people can work from home, but I think we can all agree that working from home will be the exception, not the norm. And that would have been, I think, a logical fallacy. It's something that we all understood as reasonable and understandable at the time. Today, of course, that's massively challenged. So the takeaway for financial services firms in this crisis is sort of what logical fallacies are being exposed right now. What did we know for sure? That's another Mark Twain quote, which, by the way, Michael Lewis quotes at the beginning of The Big Short. It isn't what you don't know that kills you. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And so I would ask any financial services company, I don't have the answers, but I'd say, what do you know for sure that just ain't so? What is this current crisis exposed as a logical fallacy? Obviously, the one that comes to everyone's mind is the way that we work, the office, the role of the office, the way that we interact with one another and collaborate. All of that has been exposed by this current crisis, but there's going to be many more.
And do you think that sort of our relationship with money as, the consumer state, which you talk a lot about in this book, as we are now isolated in our home and having to purchase things in very different ways, is there some sort of innovation that comes out of that, of how we are changing our relationships with our spending?
Yeah, I mean, I think it accelerates many of the things that were happening before. I don't know who's going back to a bank branch, particularly as this thing drags on, right? So within the first month, you can sort of make do, but 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And, at that point, you will have had to, make a mortgage payment, make a car payment, split money, send money to someone. Some of us may have sent money abroad. So, we'll have had to have done all of that digitally, or the vast majority of people will have had to have done so it would not surprise me if And it's not a question of tech adoption isn't always a question of like anti-banks. I mean, you know, the banks have some pretty robust mobile apps now. So I would imagine that the growth of the Bank of America mobile app has been accelerated dramatically. You know, a couple of years ago, the banks built a consortium and launched something called Zelle, which some people on this call might be familiar with, Zelle. It's on, if you've got Citi or JP Morgan or you know, Chase or Bank of America, you have Zelle, and it's a Venmo killer. It's a direct competitor to Venmo. It's Venmo without the emojis, and with the additional benefit of instant payment, which Venmo can't do. You know, I would imagine that I'll need to look at the numbers, but I would be very surprised if the same way that 10 million people became 250 on Zoom, that we wouldn't see the same sorts of numbers for something like a Zelle, like 10 million users in January and 200 million users by June.
Yeah.
So it's going to accelerate the adoption of some of the stuff that was happening already.
Yeah. I'm just mindful of time. We have a couple of questions from some of our attendees. This question is from Fran. Are there factors that clearly distinguish the winners from the losers in the fintech innovation?
Yeah, there are. Well, one of the things, I think everyone wants this to be a David Goliath story. And I was very careful not to use, you know, if you look at the subhead, it's how a group of misfits took on Wall Street and changed finance forever. It doesn't say took on Wall Street and win. And many of the people that I profile in this book, their companies won't be around. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You know, every company, let's take lending, every company is going to get hit by defaults, massive defaults over the next X number of months. But the reality is, and it'll hit the banks equally as it'll hit the fintechs. The difference is the banks are enormous and capitalized, you know, 1 billion times bigger. And so, you know, they are just better positioned to withstand some of the things that are happening in the storm. I think everyone wants this to be a David and Goliath story because we're all in love with Walter Isaacson and the innovator's dilemma. And we're all in love with this idea of Netflix versus Blockbuster or the digital camera versus Eastman Kodak, you know, but for every story like that, you know, there's the opposite story where a Snapchat comes along and everything that they build just gets adopted and stolen by, you know, Instagram and Facebook. So the change happened, but the winner was still the incumbent. It's happening now. We're on Zoom, right? So we've got all these panels and stuff. How quickly did Google and, you know, Facebook rooms build the exact same thing that Zoom had, right?
Yeah.
So that happens a lot more than we think. It happens actually for every, you know, every Netflix blockbuster, you know, there's 10 or 100 times where the incumbent says, that's a good idea, I'll have that. And that's, you know, that is ultimately what's happened inside financial services. There isn't a bank on the planet that doesn't have a robo advisor.
Yeah.
There isn't now a bank on the planet that doesn't have a pretty robust sort of mobile app. Like I mentioned, I'm a Bank of America customer. I'm pretty impressed. Their mobile app is pretty good. It's not, you know, it's not incredible, but their AI, what they call Erica, their AI is pretty cool. Like they have looked around at all of the technology that these guys created, and they've, you know, for the most part, they've adopted it. And that leaves some of the startups rather exposed.
Yeah.
Which, you know, to me, I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm not here to say, you know, this company should win and this company should lose. Would it be satisfying if, I have to be careful what I say because there are, you know, they're friends of mine and my clients. You know, if Wells Fargo, you know, went out of business and Venmo became the new Wells Fargo, I mean, I guess conceptually, you know, it would be very satisfying. But you have to remember that banks are very sticky creatures. Yes, if Wells Fargo was a brand of ketchup that you had to go buy at the store every week, it would be out of business. But the reason that it sustains, you know, body blow after body blow with big crises and scandals is because it, like every major bank, has your money, and it's
Yeah.
really, and they've sort of made it very, very difficult for you to exit that position.
Move it, yeah.
It's really, really hard. So they're very sticky creatures. They're very hard to completely disrupt.
That kind of leads to our next question from one of our audience, from Samir. He says, how will the relationship between banks and fintech firms evolve? And, you know, we've seen a lot of it recently. Morgan Stanley's acquisition of E-Trade, which is one of the early fintech, I would say. Yes. Been around for a long time, and they've been acquired. So is that sort of where we are going to see things move? Or are the banks realizing that they missed out on some of this innovation, and if you can't build it, you buy it?
Yeah. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. I wish I had a clever
question for you.
I wish I had a cleverer answer for you. The reality is that, you know, there is a question as we look back, you know, from a purely historical perspective, you know, with the banks. There's a great line in Hamilton, the musical, where Aaron Burr sings this song, "I'm not standing still, I'm lying in wait." And, you know, there is a question of whether the banks were caught flat-footed, or whether they were just biding their time to buy these companies. You know, if you look, people sort of talk about like Betterment as if it's a real threat. You know, Betterment has $22 billion of assets under management, something like that. It's a very impressive number to have got from retail. But Vanguard has $1 trillion with a T. You know, there's just orders of magnitude difference. And so what's important is the ideas that these guys unleashed. I think what's going to happen, exactly like Morgan Stanley and E-Trade, is, you know, that's a really classic, it's a really funny example, right? Of like, fintech comes along and, you know, in the discount brokerage space, you have something like Robinhood, and it offers trades for free. And then it disrupts the space, and then there's a race to the bottom, and you have, what actually happened is that Schwab lowered its prices to zero, and then TD had to follow suit, but TD couldn't survive, so it had to get bought by Schwab, and that left E-Trade being exposed, and so they needed to find a home, and they found it in Morgan Stanley. And the same kind of rush to safety, I think, is going to happen, I think, with a lot of these fintechs. Yeah, if you haven't built a robo-advisor and you're a big bank, maybe Wealthfront or Betterment looks kind of appetizing. And by this point, of course, the founders of those businesses aren't probably the majority shareholders. You know, it's probably now a board who are making some very financial, you know, decisions, and if the price is right. And a good example of this is Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs bought, you know, Honest Dollar, they bought Clarity Money, and they're putting it all together to create Marcus, which is their retail offering. So, yeah, I mean, in short, we're going to see a period, I think, of consolidation and M&A activity in the fintech space. But I think it's good because, you know, I went to see Adam Dell is a guy we cover in this book. He founded Clarity Money and then sold it to Goldman Sachs. He is the least Goldman person you've ever met in your life. Like sweater, jeans. He was riding one of those hoverboards. I think the security people at Goldman confiscated his hoverboard. You know, I like the idea that those kind of people hanging around inside Goldman Sachs. That's good for Goldman. You know what I mean? So I think it's a positive, even if it's an acquisition, even if half the names in this book get acquired and get absorbed by big banks, they're going to change the banks from the inside. So I think it's a good story in the end.
Great. Well, thanks, Dan, so much for chatting with us. It's always interesting to hear the stories and the conversations that you've had while putting this together. I do encourage anyone who hasn't read the book to pick it up. It is not boring. There's lots of interesting stories, and it does read like a drama at some point. So thanks again for giving us some time today.
It's always a good sell when you have to preface it by saying it's not boring.
But it's not. And there's a lot of interesting facts in there.
Fun.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you for spending time with us. All right. So at this point, I want to open up some breakout rooms